What if the Nazis were on the brink of unleashing secret weapons and psychological experiments so terrifying they could have rewritten history even after they lost the war? Buried beneath decades of classified documents and erased from official records, these missions were designed to manipulate minds, destabilize nations, and outlive Hitler himself. From ghost soldiers to frequency warfare, these are the 5 most chilling Nazi operations that intelligence agencies are still afraid to talk about, even today. In the early months of 1941, while Europe groaned under the iron grip of the Nazi regime, a little-known Allied intelligence unit operated from the darkened corners of Whitehall. Known only as Division K, this team specialized in unconventional warfare, information interception, and psychological operations. They were the shadow between diplomacy and sabotage, formed not to win battles, but to win silence. Rumors had emerged from deep within the Carpathian Mountains. Several Polish resistance fighters had vanished near a remote peak known as Orlo Ridge. Survivors spoke in panicked whispers of a strange humming sound echoing through the valleys, accompanied by vivid nightmares, nosebleeds, and episodes of hallucination. These were not ordinary stories of war, and they were not ignored. Division K was called to investigate, and from their files emerged a chilling thread, a Nazi facility marked Stillahawk, Silence High. Intelligence suggested the facility housed an experimental radio tower unlike anything in known Allied records. Early reconnaissance had revealed a series of concentric signal barriers, possibly jamming or even penetrating local brainwave patterns. This wasn't just about communication. It was about control. The mission was codenamed Operation Black Silence. The team sent in consisted of 5 operatives. Leading them was Captain Eliza Renner, a linguist and master codebreaker fluent in 6 languages and trained in radio frequency manipulation. Alongside her was Lieutenant Arkady Voss, a former Soviet scientist turned resistance fighter with an obsession for electromagnetic field research. The rest of the unit included Sergeant Whitcomb, demolitions expert, Corporal Henry Salas, a skilled mountaineer and survivalist, and Emil Novak, a local resistance guide with a deep personal grudge against the SS. Their insertion was done at night via glider, released from a stripped-down RAF bomber. With winds tearing across the mountain range and visibility reduced to black mist, the glide path came dangerously close to ending in a rocky oblivion. But Salas managed a near-miraculous landing in a frozen clearing 6 kilometers from the target. It was bitterly cold. The snow was unnaturally silent. Trees seemed to bend under the weight of some invisible pressure. Renner described the air as thick, not like fog or frost, but like a tension you could taste. As they ascended the ridge, the team encountered bizarre phenomena. Watches stopped working. Radios refused to transmit or even produce static. At one point, Sergeant Whitcomb stared into the distance and whispered, "Do you hear singing?" None of the others did. It was Voss who quietly began taking notes, comparing the symptoms to early-stage electromagnetic overstimulation. He noted the presence of high-pitched tones that only some could hear, possibly affecting specific brain frequencies. On the 3rd night, they spotted the tower. It jutted out from the mountain like a metallic bone, stretching skyward and braced by crystalline cables that shimmered even without light. Around it were a cluster of gray, bunker-like buildings covered in camouflage netting. Armed guards moved in rotating patterns, but it was clear they weren't just guarding something, they were enduring it. One guard was seen covering his ears and screaming into the snow. Another stumbled out into the open and fell face-first into the icy slope, twitching until still. The team moved in. Using a storm as cover, Whitcomb and Salas neutralized 2 patrols, allowing Renner and Voss to breach the northern building. Inside, they found a series of control panels humming with power. Oscilloscopes pulsed in sickly green, their readings erratic and spiked. Voss stared at a central column marked with the German word Frequenzfeld, frequency field, and muttered, "This isn't communication. It's injection." He explained it quickly. The tower was emitting layered radio signals embedded with subsonic patterns. These signals, when tuned correctly, could manipulate the amygdala and trigger fear, anxiety, or hallucinations in the human brain. The Nazis were experimenting with psychological warfare at a level the Allies hadn't even imagined. "They're trying to weaponize fear itself," Renner said. In another room, Renner found a locked cabinet containing wire-bound notebooks. Each was filled with measurements, field tests, and, disturbingly, notes referencing Allied troop behavior in North Africa and Eastern Europe. The implication was clear: these effects had already been tested, remotely. With time running out and their presence surely noticed, Whitcomb rigged explosives at the base of the tower while Voss manually detuned the signal, temporarily halting its emissions. Novak, guarding the perimeter, reported an approaching column of reinforcements, likely triggered by the tower's sudden silence. Before retreating, Renner made a fateful decision. Instead of destroying the tower entirely, she instructed Whitcomb to set a controlled blast, just enough to collapse the access routes and disable its signal, but not enough to erase all trace of the technology. She and Voss believed the Allies needed to study the mechanism if they were to understand, and counter, what might come next. They barely escaped. Pursued through the woods, they used the mountain's natural hazards to their advantage. At one point, Novak led German soldiers into a crevasse he'd mapped as a child, sealing it behind them with a snow charge. He never made it back. The surviving 4 were extracted via a midnight biplane rendezvous 2 days later, battered, bruised, and forever changed. Upon their return, Division K debriefed them extensively and sealed the operation under official secrets. The tower's technology would later inspire both Allied research into frequency countermeasures and, unofficially, the foundation of psychological operations used during the Cold War. To this day, the original site remains lost to the mountains, reclaimed by snow and time. Eliza Renner retired in 1946 and never spoke publicly about her service. Voss disappeared in East Berlin under suspicious circumstances in 1952. Whitcomb died in a car crash in London. Only Corporal Salas lived to old age, passing away in 1997. In his journal, he wrote, "We didn't stop the war. We didn't stop evil. But we silenced one scream in the night. And sometimes, that's enough." In the frozen wilderness of Telemark, Norway, winter did not merely arrive, it conquered. Snow piled high in unrelenting sheets, silencing valleys and swallowing the paths men once walked. It was here, in February 1943, that the world would unknowingly come close to an irreversible turn toward Nazi domination, and only a handful of brave souls stood in its way. The world knew about the sabotage of the Vemork plant, the mission that destroyed the Nazis' heavy water supply, key to their atomic research. It was later glorified in books and films, a story of resistance fighters skiing through the dark to strike a blow for freedom. But that was only the half of it. Hidden behind that operation, buried deeper than the snowdrifts of Rjukan Valley, was a second, darker mission. One never disclosed in Allied reports. This mission was codenamed Operation Frostveil, and its operatives were known only by their ghostly moniker, the Glacier Ghosts. Led by Major Lars Nygaard, a Norwegian-born British-trained operative, the Glacier Ghosts were 6 men and 1 woman, assembled from both the Norwegian Resistance and British Special Operations Executive. Their real task wasn't sabotage, it was acquisition. Allied command suspected the Nazis weren't just producing heavy water. They were on the verge of a breakthrough, something their top scientists had derived through a hybrid process unknown to Western science. Their orders: steal the formula before it's lost to retreat or destruction. Do not be seen. Do not exist. They moved at night. Always at night. Their breath froze in seconds. Rifles iced over. Food froze solid in pouches. But their discipline was absolute. Nygaard had drilled them to become invisible, blending with the blizzards, leaving no tracks, mimicking the howls of wolves to mask their movement. Locals whispered of spirits who moved across the ice, who stole without a sound, who killed without being seen. On the second night, they reached the upper edge of the facility, hiding in ice caves above the plant. From there, they observed a chilling sight. German guards were not just protecting the plant, they were terrified of it. Patrols were doubled near a side structure that hadn't appeared on any reconnaissance photo. It was not industrial. It looked more like a chapel made of steel, with frost forming unnatural geometric patterns on its walls. The locals called it Iskapellet, the ice chapel. It was inside the chapel that the team believed the real experiments were conducted. The infiltration began under a new moon. Ingrid Mikkelsen, the team's chemical analyst and explosives expert, used a rare compound called chlorit snow, which melted silently and refroze in under 10 seconds. It allowed them to silently tunnel through a maintenance shaft. What they found inside turned their mission from espionage to horror. The walls were coated in rime, but it wasn't just frost. It formed in precise crystalline shapes, suggesting deliberate energy discharge. In the central chamber stood a cylindrical apparatus surrounded by reinforced glass and cradled in copper tubing. Inside was a silvery liquid oscillating unnaturally, like it was resisting gravity. Next to it was a German scientist, pale and wide-eyed, furiously scribbling in a ledger. The team waited for him to leave, but he never did. He sat, staring at the liquid, until a tremor in the floor startled him and he vomited blood onto his own notes. Nygaard and Mikkelsen moved in. The man tried to scream but choked instead. His final word, as translated by Mikkelsen, "It burns cold." They took the ledger. They took samples of the silvery fluid, sealing it in vacuum containers Mikkelsen had prepared in advance. And then they planted the charges, not just to destroy the chapel, but to make it appear as if it was an accident from within. Extraction was nearly a disaster. One of the team, Leif Strand, fell through a frozen river while crossing a ravine. They pulled him out, but his legs were ruined. He begged to be left behind, and when they refused, he pulled a small pistol from his coat and gave Nygaard a look of peace. They heard only the click of the trigger. It had frozen. So they carried him. When the chapel exploded, it did not create a blast. It caused an implosion of frost, a sudden expansion of supercooled vapor that carved crystalline trees into the rocks for miles. Locals said the mountains sang that night. The team delivered the samples to a hidden airfield carved into the forest. A waiting RAF Mosquito took the package. It was the last the Glacier Ghosts would hear of their success. Only 3 of them made it back. Nygaard died from sepsis 3 days after the mission. Mikkelsen was later poisoned in London under suspicious circumstances blamed on German agents. Of the survivors, only one, Sergeant Carl Dolan, lived long enough to tell the story, dictated into cassette tapes discovered in 1988 beneath a false floor in his attic. What became of the silvery fluid? The ledger? The data? No public records exist. Some believe it accelerated the Manhattan Project. Others whisper it was hidden to prevent a moral catastrophe. A footnote in a declassified British science memo simply read, "Properties incompatible with life, samples destroyed. Formula archived under Section 9, eyes only." Years later, trekkers in the Telemark region reported seeing flashes of blue light in the distance, echoing howls of wind without storms, and frost forming in unnatural patterns on rocks. No trace of the chapel remains. No ruins. No foundation. But on a certain winter's night, if you're lucky, or perhaps cursed, you might see 6 ghostly figures skiing silently across the snow, burdened not with weapons, but with the unbearable weight of secrets. Warsaw, 1942. The city was a skeleton wrapped in barbed wire. Streets once filled with song and commerce now echoed with the hard boots of German patrols and the hollow groans of the starving. The Warsaw Ghetto, sealed off by a brutal wall, held over 400,000 Jews in conditions unfit for life, much less survival. But in the shadows, beyond the reach of Nazi eyes, resistance took root, and sometimes, secrets found ways to escape. Among the resistance was a man named Jakub Langer, a Polish-Jewish linguist who, before the war, had taught at the University of Warsaw and published papers on ancient dialects. When the Nazis came, he lost his position, his home, and most of his family. But Jakub had something they didn't expect, an extraordinary memory, a gift for mimicry, and a quiet, simmering rage. By 1941, he had become a courier and code handler for OB, the Jewish Combat Organization, and a silent operative for British intelligence. His British contact, known only as Douglas, gave Jakub a mission that would change the war, and disappear from public memory for nearly 50 years. In early 1942, an anonymous source within the Nazi hierarchy leaked a set of documents to a British embassy in neutral Sweden. The documents hinted at a horrifying strategy being finalized by Himmler's office, what would later be known as the final solution. But these were not just vague orders. They were detailed blueprints, timetables, transportation plans, locations, signatures. British intelligence didn't just need to confirm the documents. They needed proof that could not be denied. They needed a second set, verified, and signed by key Nazi officials, and word was, such documents existed inside the Warsaw Ghetto. Jakub was given an impossible task: retrieve them. He had 6 days. Using forged identification and disguises honed from his years teaching dialects, Jakub posed as a German-speaking Jewish clerk working in the Judenrat, the Jewish council forced to administer the ghetto. He had access to the paper flows, to the backrooms where SS officers dumped files for processing, confident no one would dare touch them. What Jakub found shocked even him. He discovered a leather suitcase belonging to an SS logistics officer, abandoned after a rushed inspection during a failed inspection raid. Inside were 30 pages of signed, stamped documents detailing resettlement procedures to Treblinka and Sobibor. They named transports not yet departed. They outlined liquidation targets by street. They included chilling euphemisms like final capacity optimization and irrecoverable relocation metrics. Jakub knew he had to get the suitcase out. But the ghetto was sealed. Smuggling even a letter carried the risk of death. A suitcase was unthinkable. Still, he found a way. In the ruins of an old synagogue beneath Naluki Street, Jakub's resistance cell had built a tunnel that exited into a burned-out tram depot outside the wall. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for a man. Jakub and 3 others widened it over 2 nights with spoons and bone knives. On the 3rd night, with the moon masked by cloud, Jakub crawled through, dragging the suitcase behind him. It took 3 hours. When he emerged on the other side, his hands were bloodied, his knees ruined, and the suitcase was soaked in sewage and frost. But the documents were dry, wrapped in waxcloth, sealed tight. From there, Jakub used his final contact in the Polish underground to secure passage to Krakow, where a British handler waited. He handed off the suitcase, received a single nod, and vanished back into occupied territory. The documents were flown to London under highest classification. What happened next, however, remains one of the most controversial moments in Allied intelligence history. The documents were verified, authenticated, and cross-referenced with signals intelligence from Bletchley Park. The evidence was overwhelming. The British government now had irrefutable proof that the Nazis were carrying out a mass extermination plan targeting Europe's Jewish population. They had train numbers, names, orders, logistics. But they told no one. Prime Minister Churchill, briefed by military intelligence, allegedly stated, "This is monstrous, beyond imagination," but the official policy remained unchanged. The documents were locked away under a top-secret classification, reportedly for fear of inciting panic, overstretching military response, or, as some historians later argued, stirring sympathy that could complicate post-war settlements. In short, the truth was shelved. Lives were not saved. Jakub never knew. He believed the world had heard. That help would come. He stayed in Warsaw, helping lead the ghetto uprising in April 1943. He was captured during the final days of the revolt, tortured, and executed in Pojak prison. He died never knowing his suitcase had been buried in a vault under Whitehall. Decades passed. In 1994, a British historian named Margaret Ashcombe uncovered references to the Langer briefcase while researching denied wartime intelligence. After a Freedom of Information battle, redacted versions of the documents were released. The suitcase had indeed existed. So had the names, the orders, the mischance to intervene. The briefcase now sits in a sealed display at the Imperial War Museum, leather cracked, buckles rusted, its contents faded but legible. On its handle is etched a single word in Hebrew, zikaron, remembrance. In her last published article, Ashcombe wrote, "Jakub Langer didn't carry just a suitcase. He carried a warning, a chance. And though history buried it, the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Every year, on the anniversary of the Ghetto Uprising, a small stone is placed beside the case. No one knows who places it. No one has ever been seen. But there it is, every April. Waiting. Buried beneath the roaring factories of Essen, Germany, in a bunker so secret it didn't appear on any map, was a project so bizarre that even within the highest ranks of the Nazi war machine, only a handful knew of its existence. It was called Project Harlequin, and it aimed to win the war not with bombs or bullets, but with deception so perfect it could rewrite entire battles. The mastermind behind the project was a former stage illusionist turned Nazi psychological warfare specialist named Ernst Koenig. Before the war, Koenig had been a sensation in Berlin's cabaret circuit. He could vanish handkerchiefs and guess thoughts, manipulate crowds, and control their emotions. Goebbels himself had attended one of his shows and reportedly said, "This man is a weapon of mass persuasion." Koenig was given a laboratory, a staff of scientists, actors, and engineers, and a blank check. What he built was astonishing. Allied intelligence first learned of Harlequin through a bizarre series of events in Normandy in 1944. An entire American reconnaissance platoon disappeared from a French village without a trace. No firefight. No bodies. Just radios left running and boots abandoned in the grass. A month later, in Belgium, a British unit reported stumbling across what appeared to be a group of American soldiers constructing a temporary bridge. The uniforms were accurate. Accents were perfect. But something felt wrong. Too rehearsed, too polished. When the British officer returned to the site with backup, the bridge was gone. So were the soldiers. Only a single Nazi SS helmet was found, painted on the inside with a laughing face. The Allies realized they were facing something new. Operation Fox Mirror was initiated by the British Special Intelligence Bureau, a top-secret team specializing in counter-deception and classified psychological warfare. Leading them was Major Evelyn Stroud, a woman with a background in theater direction, espionage, and cryptanalysis. Her insight: if someone's performing for you, they want something. If they're good, you don't know what. If they're perfect, you never know they were there. Stroud's team tracked the source of the anomalies to a cluster of coded radio broadcasts emanating from central Germany, encrypted not in standard Morse, but in rhythmic pulses resembling musical notation. This led them to uncover a hidden pattern: messages disguised as classical compositions broadcast from a remote relay station. Decoded, the messages mapped out simulated troop deployments, phantom divisions, ghost regiments, fake artillery units. The Nazi regime wasn't just fooling the Allies, they were preparing to fool entire armies. The center of the operation was found near Essen, beneath a disused opera house. Stroud's team infiltrated the facility in September 1944 under the cover of a Luftwaffe bombing raid. What they found defied belief. Underground, beneath layers of concrete, was a full-scale simulation chamber, a war theater. Rooms lined with mirrors, adjustable lighting, backdrops of battlefield terrain, smoke machines, and speakers simulating artillery fire. Dozens of uniformed actors trained to mimic Allied and Axis soldiers alike. Koenig had even designed mobile set pieces that could be deployed near real combat zones, illusions meant to trick aerial surveillance and confuse battlefield intelligence. At the heart of it all was a machine Koenig called the Echo, a massive sound manipulation system that could project troop movements, engine noises, even battle cries across several kilometers, tricking enemy forces into responding to enemies that weren't there. It had already been used. Stroud discovered evidence that a failed Allied push near Arnhem had been due, in part, to Harlequin interference. The British had been baited into attacking an empty position while the real German troops flanked them. Losses were catastrophic. In the center of the chamber was Koenig himself, tall, skeletal, dressed in a military-cut version of a magician's suit. He greeted Stroud and her team as though they were expected. "You've come for the truth," he said, "but truth is a lens. I only changed the lighting." What followed was surreal. Koenig offered them a tour. He demonstrated a fake machine gun nest, a camouflaged tank made of wire and canvas, even a dying soldier simulation complete with blood spray mechanisms. Every effect had been tested in the field. Every illusion perfected to survive only long enough to kill. Stroud had seen enough. She gave the order to destroy everything. But Koenig had one last trick. He activated a self-destruct sequence hidden within the Echo's system. As the lights dimmed and alarms blared, he turned to Stroud and whispered, "You cannot win against what you cannot see. The war is not about killing. It's about believing." He vanished into smoke. Literally. A hidden escape hatch, a smoke bomb, and mirrors. Stroud's team never found him. The facility collapsed minutes later. Only fragments of Project Harlequin were salvaged, a roll of painted battlefield tarpaulins, blueprints for sonic projection rigs, and reels of eerie training films where German actors portrayed American soldiers with flawless fluency. After the war, many of Harlequin's principles were quietly adopted by Allied militaries. Inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, sonic deception, they became standard tools in Cold War espionage. But the full scale and ambition of Koenig's work remained classified for decades. In 1978, a BBC documentary briefly touched on Harlequin, but most footage was redacted. One former SOE operative, now in his 80s, said on camera, "We thought we were playing chess with Hitler. But Koenig? He was playing theater, and we were the audience." To this day, no one knows what became of Ernst Koenig. Rumors persist. Some say he died in the bunker. Others claim he escaped to Argentina. A few believe he was recruited, perhaps not by the Allies, but by someone else. Someone who understood the power of illusion in a world built on information. But every once in a while, in war-torn regions around the world, a strange symbol is found painted on abandoned military equipment, a laughing face inside a helmet. And those who find it report the same thing. They heard soldiers who weren't there, saw fires that left no ashes, and for a moment, believed they were somewhere else. In the waning months of World War II, as the Allies closed in on Berlin and the world braced for the final death rattle of the Third Reich, a final, desperate project took root beneath the forests of Bavaria, Operation Nightshade. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It wasn't a bomb or a plane or even a strategy. It was a gambit, a final psychological strike, designed not to destroy the enemy, but to corrupt their future. The mission began with a letter. In March 1945, British intelligence intercepted a coded message between two high-ranking Nazi officials. It was routine at first, updates on collapsing supply chains, morale issues, troop withdrawals. But then, at the bottom, was a single phrase repeated in cipher: "The Nightshade is in bloom." Analysts at Bletchley Park puzzled over the phrase. It wasn't a call sign, codebook reference, or part of the Enigma protocols. One linguist, a former Oxford professor of folklore, recognized the metaphor. Nightshade, belladonna, an ancient poison associated with witches, seduction, and illusions. The phrase, he suggested, wasn't military at all. It was symbolic. A warning. MI6 dispatched an elite joint British-American team under deep secrecy to investigate, codenamed Task Force Ember. It was led by Commander Elias Voss, a half-German intelligence officer who had once trained as a psychiatrist before the war. Voss understood something most generals didn't. Nazi ideology wasn't just military. It was psychological warfare at its purest. And he suspected Nightshade was its final expression. The investigation led them to the Black Forest. Locals spoke of increased German activity near a disused monastery deep in the hills. Trucks moving in and out at night. Scientists escorted by SS guards. Strange lights pulsing through the trees. No aircraft ever landed or took off. Everything was moved by road and buried beneath camouflage. On April 9, 1945, Task Force Ember breached the monastery compound during a thunderstorm. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Beneath the monastery, inside a repurposed wine cellar, was a hidden lab complex operated by the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi pseudo-academic institute responsible for occult research, racial experiments, and psychological studies. There were no weapons here, only files, chemical labs, and rooms filled with broadcasting equipment. At the center of the operation was Dr. Alaric Steiner, a neuroscientist whose work had been deemed too radical even for Nazi leadership in 1942. Officially, he had disappeared. In truth, he had gone underground, literally, working in the monastery on something Hitler had once called the spirit bomb. Steiner's belief was terrifying, that mass behavior could be manipulated not by violence or propaganda alone, but through sustained sensory distortion, specifically sound and frequency. By studying the psychological effects of radio wave harmonics, language triggers, and subliminal auditory patterns, he believed he could imprint thoughts, fears, or even desires into a population without their awareness. Nightshade was the operational version of this theory. Hidden in crates throughout the lab were phononic devices, odd-looking machines with speaker arrays, sound-modulating cores, and liquid mercury channels. Their purpose: to broadcast sustained low-frequency patterns embedded with distorted human speech, most of it in English. Steiner's final goal was simple, yet insidious: deploy these devices behind enemy lines, not to control troops, but to haunt the civilian mind. Create doubt, dissolution, paranoia, anxiety. He believed if you could convince a generation they were already broken, you wouldn't need to conquer them. One recovered recording revealed a prototype. You cannot trust your neighbor. The war is not over. They are lying to you. You are not free. Distorted, black-masked, looping under a layer of ambient static. It was designed to feel discovered, not heard. The plan was to hide these devices across Europe, in Paris sewers, London rail tunnels, Moscow subways, and activate them post-surrender. The war would appear to be over, but its echo would remain, festering inside the minds of the victors. Commander Voss and his team shut it down. Or so they thought. As they prepared demolition charges, a hidden room was discovered behind a sealed wine rack. Inside, they found Steiner himself, sitting before a massive audio console, completely still. He had poisoned himself, likely moments before the raid. But before dying, he had triggered one last broadcast. The transmission, unlike the others, was not found in any documentation. It was longer, more elaborate, and directed not at the enemy, but the future. There is no peace. Only pause. You think you've won, but you haven't even begun to fight the real war, inside your heads. We will not conquer the world. We will whisper into it. The facility was destroyed. The machines crushed. The documents burned. But then something strange happened. Over the next 6 months, unexplained broadcasts began to emerge across Europe. Untraceable radio signals. Frequencies that caused unease, tension, and headaches in those who listened too long. In some cities, like Vienna and Brussels, people reported hearing voices through static that weren't there. Some even claimed to hear their own thoughts repeated back to them in foreign languages. The broadcasts vanished as quickly as they came. MI6 denied everything. So did the Americans. The official record of Operation Nightshade was classified until 1997, and even then, most files were redacted beyond comprehension. One entry, handwritten and almost missed, simply read: "Do not listen past 6 minutes. All personnel must be monitored post-debrief. Paranoia is contagious." As for Voss, he resigned shortly after. He was last seen living in seclusion in the Scottish Highlands, where he reportedly refused to own a radio or telephone. In a private interview conducted before his death, he said, "We won the war, but something from it still hums in the background, and I think it's still waiting to be heard." Some conspiracy theorists believe Steiner succeeded, that fragments of his broadcasts still pulse through forgotten frequencies, picked up in moments of static when you're driving alone, half awake, between stations. A whisper here, a suggestion there, just enough to twist something inside. The war ended in May 1945. But sometimes, late at night, when the radio flickers, when you feel uncertain for no reason, when silence itself seems to say something, you wonder if the nightshade ever stopped blooming. Every case adds a new layer of mystery, leaving more questions than answers. Which one lingers in your mind, and what's your take on what really happened?